Okay, so you'll often hear neurons referred to as dopaminergic, right? Dopamine releasing, or serotonergic, that's serotonin releasing, or glutamatergic, they release glutamate. As if there's only one neurotransmitter that's being released typically from every neuron, and you can sort of code them by the specific neurotransmitter that they, release. And the idea that each each neuron only releases one neurotransmitter is something called Dale's principle or Dale's law, and it dates back for over 100 years, and it was really had a powerful influence over how people thought about chemical communication at a synapse. Like a dopaminergic neuron releases dopamine. And it turns out that while neurons do have what we call a primary neurotransmitter, that is to say, like a dopaminergic neuron, 80%, let's say, of the neurotransmitter being released will be dopamine. So that's its primary neurotransmitter. Very often, quite often, almost all the time, there are other what we call co-localized neurotransmitters, secondary and tertiary neurotransmitters that are being released simultaneously along with that primary neurotransmitter. There's up to like 5 different neurotransmitters often being released, into the cleft when, an action potential arrives and, is converted into the release of neurotransmitter. So at a dopaminergic synapse, the dopamine releasing neuron, that's its primary neurotransmitter, that's the bulk of what it's releasing. However, they're going to be co-localized peptide neurotransmitters and other neurotransmitters located there as well. So how does that happen? Well, what's really interesting about this is that, neurons, store, right? They synthesize and they store their neurotransmitter in vesicles, at least most of them, depending on the neurotransmitter. Dopamine, in a dopaminergic neuron, you're going to have synthesizing enzymes for dopamine, that'll grab the widely available amino acid tyrosine and, convert it into dopamine. And then you'll have, some kind of a transporter that'll grab the dopamine and pack it inside the vesicle, a vesicular transporter for dopamine, right? And the majority of the vesicular transporters, in a dopaminergic neuron are going to be, targeting dopamine, selective for dopamine. However, with co-localized, neurotransmitters, which you'll also have in almost all cases, those neurons will also express the synthesizing enzymes, to build them as well, right? And they'll also express vesicular transporters that'll be embedded in the vesicle membrane along with the dopamine vesicular transporters that will pack some of the co-localized neurotransmitter in those same vesicles along with dopamine. And I find this pretty fascinating. Like the precise ratio of your primary neurotransmitter, let's say dopamine, to your secondary neurotransmitter, let's say a neuropeptide like galanin, for example, will not be fixed. It'll change. It'll alter depending upon circumstances, even just depending upon circadian circumstance, like what time of day it is, or what have you been doing, what's happening. So the chemical communication at a synapse, presynaptic to postsynaptic here, is going to involve more than just primary neurotransmitters that are always the same. There's going to be adjustments made in the ratio of, dopamine to galanin to other co-localized neurotransmitters, even, across a daytime in response to various things that you're doing or experiencing across that day. And a lot of that has to do, of course, with changes in, synthesis of the, vesicular transporters that bring in the dopamine, for example, versus the vesicular transporters that bring in other co-localized neurotransmitters. There's a constant, kind of communication between genes, transcription, translation, and, what's happening, at synapses, and changes in, the level of synthesizing enzymes, degradative enzymes, vesicular transporters, presynaptic terminal reuptake transporters, all this machinery. There's an equilibrium, but it can shift, and usually does shift. But I want you to just know that Dale's principle stated that every neuron has just one neurotransmitter that releases, but that's not true. That's regularly violated. There is a primary neurotransmitter typically, but then there's a whole host of additional co-localized neurotransmitters as well.